Just a lot of the things that we talk about and we think about, come across routinely in our lives, it seems to me, are completely unimaginable. And yet we seem to be able to manage them anyway, to manage that task of imagining them. So I'm just wondering about how we do imagine the unimaginable. I mean, certainly the routine imaginary things we talk about, abstract concepts like justice and truth and so on, that I've spoken about before, we seem to imagine those using conceptual metaphors or something like that. But obviously, a lot of the things that I've talked about recently, with the developments in science particularly, are not abstract because they're well, not only abstract because they're difficult to frame in any kind of truly descriptive language or sensory language. Really. They're abstract because they're outside of the realm of human experience entirely. So although when we talk about justice, for example, we have experience of justice. We kind of run into examples of it all the time. But so the difficulty isn't one that we don't access that. The difficulty is one of conceptualizing it, and that's where metaphor comes in. So we have images of scales, for example, that kind of thing. But as I say, some scientific ideas, particularly, we don't run into. We just never come across, and never would. So I'm thinking of something like the Big Bang, for example, or the beginning of time, whatever it was, however it came about. Let's assume it was the Big Bang. But the idea that there's a beginning of time is so outside of human experience, we are so embedded within time, that not only is it difficult to talk and think about because of its abstract nature, it's difficult to think and talk about because we just never come across examples of it. Time never starts and stops. It just keeps going. So how do we think about it? I mean, in that example, one of the ways that I've heard it talked about is using a kind of spatial metaphor. Again, it's a metaphor, but it's a kind of spatial / geometrical metaphor. So you imagine heading towards the beginning of time, going back in time. That's kind of like heading towards the North Pole. You imagine time as being mapped across the surface of the Earth. So as you go back in time, you imagine yourself moving towards the North Pole. But when you get to the beginning of time at the North Pole, it's not that there's something before it. It's just that there's nowhere to go apart from further south. Everywhere you go at that point is south. So it's a kind of visualization of those ideas, of an incomprehensible idea. It allows us to imagine the unimaginable. The other way that we imagine the unimaginable is using a language like mathematics. What I've just been thinking about there is, is that truly another way, or are we really using covert metaphors? And I guess here I'm leaning on Raphael Nunez and George Lakoff's work on where mathematics comes from. Because something like calculating the volumes of higher dimensional shapes, let's say. It's very easy to calculate the volume of a cube. You multiply the height by the depth by the length, and that gives you the volume in cubic meters, let's say. But it's perfectly possible to calculate the volume of a tesseract, a four-dimensional shape, using exactly the same process. If we assume that all these dimensions are kind of at 90 degrees to one another, to get the quadratic volume of a tesseract, you would simply multiply the length of one dimension by the length of another dimension, by the length of the third dimension, and then by the length of the fourth dimension. So if all of those dimensions were 2 meters in extension, I can actually go through the dimensions, I think. If you take an extension on a plane that's 2 meters long, you would say that's 2 meters. I beg your pardon, and on a flat the surface, you would say it's 2 meters. If you extended that into a plane, you would multiply 2 by 2 and say that's 4 square meters. if you extended that out into a third dimension, into a cube, you would say that's 2 by 2 by 2, that's 8 cubic meters. And if you wanted to imagine that extended into the fourth dimension to make a tesseract, you would simply go 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, which is 16 quadratic meters in volume. Now there's no way of visualizing that, I don't think. I'm trying to visualize it, and I can't. I've heard that somebody, I can't remember, I read somewhere that somebody said they could, but I can't really see how you can, not without at least making it kind of move. But even though you can't visualize it, so therefore you can't imagine it in any meaningful sense, you can imagine it mathematically, or you could at least produce a number at the end of a certain calculation. But what's happening when we do that? Is there really a metaphor being deployed when we do that? Or is this purely moving symbols around? And Nunez and Lakoff say that mathematics ultimately is not just moving random symbols around, it is the mobilization of metaphors. So in that particular case, it's, I guess it's something like the counting of objects, in which numbers are kind of count tokens. So you count numbers of meters, and we treat dimensions as kind of like containers in which to put numbers of objects. So here's these two objects that we call meters, and it could be stones or it could be apples or twigs, but we call them meters. And we put them in this one container called dimension 1, and there they are, there are 2 of them. And then we add this second dimension and put another 2 in there, and then we count them all up and there's 4. Actually that's not going to work, because you're putting the 2 in the third dimension. That should be 8 and I'm only getting 6. I don't know how to get that last bit. Maybe it's to do with lines or something like that, divisions of lines rather than objects. I don't know, but it seems to me there's some kind of deployment of a metaphor there, in which parts of the object of the image are suppressed and brought out in different ways to kind of move through the calculation. So that's imagining the unimaginable, I guess. I think Einstein is supposed to have said something like that the strange thing about the world is that we can imagine it, or that we can understand it. I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like that, which is in contradiction to what J.B.S. Haldane said, which is the world is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. It seems like we have these engines of supposition, these methods for supposing, which keep bringing the world up and keep imagining it for us, which is remarkable, really, that we can imagine something like the beginning of time, or like the quadratic volume of a tesseract. I don't really know what I'm talking about here, actually. I don't know much about maths. I might be just, I don't know what I'm doing.